You are warm now, wherever you are. You might be beneath a blanket or sitting in a heated room or wearing enough layers that the air around you feels comfortable. The temperature is something you control, something you adjust without thinking. You reach for a thermostat, or pull a blanket higher, or move closer to a source of heat. These are simple actions. They are available to you at any moment. But there was a time when none of this existed. Not the thermostat, not the central heating, not even the ability to light a fire safely in the place where you slept. For the men who sailed wooden ships across the Atlantic in the 1700s, warmth was not something they controlled. It was something they conserved, something they protected, something they created with their own bodies when every other source of heat had been taken away. Tonight, we will look at how pirates and sailors survived freezing nights at sea. We will examine the wooden ships that offered no insulation from the cold. We will see why fire could not be used below deck, why the ocean pulled heat away from everything it touched, and how men slept for weeks or months in conditions that would seem impossible now. This is not a story of adventure or drama. It is a story of wool and wood, of hammocks hung shoulder to shoulder, of bodies pressed close in darkness, and of the quiet methods that kept men alive when the wind never stopped and the cold never left. We will move slowly through this world. We will look closely at the details that mattered, the thickness of fabric, the choice of sleeping position, the knowledge passed from experienced sailors to young men on their first voyage. These were not remarkable people doing extraordinary things. They were ordinary men solving a problem that presented itself every single night. How to sleep when you cannot get warm, and how to wake again when the ship and the sea demand it. Let yourself settle into this examination. There is no urgency here, only the steady accumulation of small facts that together explain how human beings adapted to a world we no longer inhabit. A ship in the 1700s was a structure of wood floating on water. That is the essential fact. Everything else followed from this. The hull was made of oak planks, thick and heavy, fastened with iron bolts and sealed with tar. The deck was pine or fir, worn smooth by feet in salt water. The masts were taller trees stripped and shaped, held upright by rope as thick as a man's arm. Every surface was organic material, wood that had once grown in a forest, fiber that had been spun and woven. There was no insulation, no barrier between the interior of the ship and the temperature of the world outside. The ocean surrounded the hull on all sides. Water holds temperature longer than air does. In northern waters or during winter crossings of the Atlantic, the ocean was cold, not freezing, but cold enough that immersion would kill within minutes. That cold transferred through the wooden planks, slowly but constantly. The hull acted as a conductor, pulling heat from the air inside the ship and releasing it into the vast reservoir of water below. Above the deck, wind moved without stopping. Ships were designed to catch this wind. The sails were shaped to channel it. The rigging was arranged to maximize its force. This meant that sailors lived in a constant flow of moving air. Wind strips heat from anything warm. It evaporates moisture, and evaporation cools. A man standing on deck in freezing weather, with wind moving across his body, lost heat far faster than he would standing still in the same temperature on land. At night, the temperature dropped. This was true everywhere, but especially true on open water, where there was no land to hold the day's warmth. No trees or buildings to block the wind. When the sun set, the air temperature could fall 10 or 15 degrees within an hour. The wood of the ship, already cold from contact with the ocean, grew colder still. Dampness was everywhere. Salt spray came over the railings whenever waves struck the hull. Fog formed when warm air met cold water. Rain fell and pooled on the deck before draining through the scuppers. Everything touched by this moisture stayed wet. Fabric did not dry. Rope stayed heavy with water. The air below deck carried a permanent humidity that made the cold feel deeper, more penetrating than dry cold ever could. The ship rocked constantly. Even in calm seas, there was motion, the gentle rise and fall, the slight rotation as waves passed beneath the keel. In rough weather, The motion became violent. This movement made certain tasks impossible. It made others dangerous, and it meant that any source of heat that required stillness, that required careful tending, could not be used. There was a galley, usually located near the center of the ship, where food was prepared. This galley contained a firebox, a brick-lined metal stove, where wood could be burned in a controlled space. This was the only approved location for open flame aboard the vessel. The firebox was designed with care. Iron doors that could be shut, a chimney that vented smoke above deck, and a brick base that prevented the heat from scorching the wooden deck beneath. But even this fire was extinguished every evening. Captains did not allow flames to burn through the night. The risk was too great. The ship moved too much. The danger of a spark escaping, of embers falling onto tarred rope or dry wood, meant that fire was permitted only when someone could watch it constantly, and when weather conditions were calm enough to keep it contained. So when night came, the fire went out. The galley cooled. The residual heat from the bricks faded over the course of hours, and by the deep part of the night, even the space around the firebox was no warmer than the rest of the ship. This was the world where sailors slept. A wooden structure floating on cold water, surrounded by wind, filled with damp air and offering no source of warmth once the sun had set and the galley fire had been extinguished. The ship protected them from the ocean itself, from drowning, from waves, from the immediate danger of exposure to open water, but it did not protect them from the cold. That was not what it was built to do. The men who lived aboard these ships understood this. They did not expect warmth. They did not complain about its absence. They adapted to a reality that could not be changed, and they developed methods to survive conditions that would be considered unbearable now. Fire aboard a wooden ship was not simply dangerous. It was the fastest path to total destruction. Every captain knew this. Every experienced sailor had heard the stories or seen the evidence himself. Ships burned completely in less than an hour, sometimes less than 30 minutes. Once fire took hold in the right location, there was no saving the vessel. The only choice was to abandon ship, to lower boats if there was time, and to put as much distance as possible between yourself and the flames before the powder magazine exploded. The entire structure was fuel. The hull was oak, dense and hard, but still wood. The decking was pine and fir, softer woods that caught more easily. The masts and spars were dried timber, tall and exposed to air, perfect for burning. Every surface had been coated with tar to seal gaps and prevent rot. Tar was sticky, black, and highly flammable. The ropes, hundreds of feet of hemp rope holding the masts upright, controlling the sails, securing cargo, were often tarred as well for preservation. This created a network of flammable material running throughout the entire ship. Below deck, conditions made fire even more dangerous. The spaces were enclosed with limited ventilation. Air could not circulate freely. Smoke would fill these spaces within seconds, making it impossible to see, impossible to breathe, impossible to organize any response. The companionways, the steep wooden ladders connecting different decks, were narrow. In darkness, in smoke, in panic, these passages became bottlenecks where men would be trapped. Many ships carried gunpowder. Naval vessels carried large quantities for their cannon. Even merchant ships and pirate vessels kept powder stores for weapons and signaling. This powder was stored in a dedicated magazine, usually located deep in the ship, below the waterline if possible, in a space lined with copper or lead to prevent sparks. But if fire reached the magazine, the result was not a burning ship. It was an explosion that tore the vessel apart, sending debris and bodies into the water, leaving nothing intact. The motion of the ship made controlling any fire nearly impossible. A flame that was safely contained in calm water could tip, spill, or spread when the ship rolled. Lanterns, if they were allowed at all, had to be enclosed in metal housings with thick glass panels. Even then, a sudden lurch could shatter the glass or knock the lantern from its hook. The same rocking motion that sailors learned to walk with, that became unconscious after days at sea, turned any open flame into an unpredictable hazard. Water was available. The ocean surrounded the ship, but fighting a fire with seawater was difficult and often ineffective. Buckets had to be filled by lowering them over the side on ropes then hauled back up. Forming a bucket line took time and coordination. By the time water was being thrown onto flames, the fire had usually spread beyond what buckets could contain, and seawater did not extinguish tar fires well. Tar floated. It burned on the surface of water. Dousing it sometimes just spread the flames. Historical records documented these disasters. Ships lost in harbor because a candle tipped in a cabin. Vessels destroyed at anchor when a galley fire escaped containment. Entire fleets reduced because one ship caught fire and the wind carried burning debris to neighboring vessels. These were not rare events. They were common enough that every sailor knew the risk personally, had likely witnessed it, and understood that prevention was the only real defense. So captains were strict. Open flames were forbidden in sleeping quarters. Candles were rarely allowed and only under direct supervision. Smoking tobacco below deck was punishable. The galley fire, the single permitted flame, was monitored constantly while lit and extinguished completely by early evening. In bad weather, it was not lit at all. The crew ate cold food, or no food, rather than risk the fire spreading. This created the central problem of cold nights at sea. The one thing that could provide warmth, fire, was the one thing that could not be permitted. Sailors could not gather around a stove. They could not light braziers in the sleeping quarters. They could not warm themselves with flame in any form once the sun went down. The choice was absolute: accept the cold or risk death by fire. They accepted the cold. They had no other option. And so they developed every other method available to them, every technique that did not involve flame, to retain enough body heat to survive the night and wake again when their watch was called. Human beings are adaptable. When one solution is forbidden, they find another. The sailors of the 1700s could not heat their ships, so instead they insulated their bodies, positioned themselves carefully, stayed close to one another, and learned to sleep in conditions that most people now would never have to endure. Cold at sea was not the same as cold on land. The ocean carried cold differently. It surrounded the ship. It rose from below through wooden planks that spent half their existence submerged in water near freezing. It arrived on wind that had traveled 1,000 miles across open water, gathering cold from the surface, never slowing, never blocked by hills or forests or buildings. The air itself became a river of cold pouring across the deck and finding every gap in the rails, every space between boards, every opening that led below. Salt spray added another dimension. Waves struck the hull. Water exploded upward in fine mist. This spray coated everything it touched. Rigging grew stiff with salt. Canvas turned white. The deck became slick. At night, in northern waters or during winter crossings, this spray began to freeze. Ice formed on ropes. It built up on the bowsprit. Sailors woke to find their ship encrusted, the wood beneath hidden under a skin of frozen seawater. The dampness never left. Even days without rain or heavy seas brought no true dryness. Fog rolled in. Moisture condensed on cold surfaces. The air itself held water. Wool clothing absorbed it. Canvas hammocks grew heavy with it. Wood swelled with it. Nothing aboard a ship in the open ocean ever became completely dry. The cold worked through this dampness, using moisture as a pathway into fabric and flesh. Wind at sea blew without obstacle. On land, wind might gust and fade, blocked temporarily by terrain. At sea, it blew steadily, hour after hour, day after day. It moved across the vast cold reservoir of the ocean, drawing temperature from water that held its chill with the stubbornness of great mass. This wind found every sailor on deck. It found those below through hatches that could not stay sealed, through gaps around masts where they passed through deck levels, through the simple fact that ships needed ventilation, or the air below would turn foul. Night brought the sharpest cold. The sun, even a weak winter sun, provided some warmth during daylight hours. Dark wood absorbed what heat it could. Sailors working on deck generated body heat through movement. But sunset changed everything. The warmth accumulated during the day radiated away into the vast darkness. The ocean, massive and cold, remained at its steady temperature while the air above dropped. The wooden ship, thin-walled and uninsulated, offered no barrier to this cooling. Temperature inside the hull followed temperature outside with only minutes of delay. The Little Ice Age had not ended. The 1700s fell within this period of unusual cold. Winters were harsher, summers were cooler. The North Atlantic grew more treacherous. Ice appeared at latitudes where it had been rare. Ships crossing from Europe to America encountered conditions their grandfathers would have considered exceptional. The cold was not imagined. It was not the normal cold of previous centuries. It was measurably, documentably colder, and the sailors had no way to know this represented a temporary fluctuation. They simply endured what seemed eternal. Temperature swings at sea were dramatic. A warm afternoon could give way to a night so cold that breath froze in beards. The ocean itself did not change temperature rapidly, but the air above it responded to sun and darkness with violent shifts. 20 degrees could separate afternoon from midnight. A sailor comfortable at dusk would be shivering violently by the middle watch. The ship provided no buffer. The thin wooden walls that separated inside from outside gave an illusion of shelter, but almost no thermal protection. Water conducted heat away from the body far faster than air. Damp clothing accelerated this theft. A sailor in wet wool lost body heat at rates that could lead to hypothermia, even in temperatures above freezing. The constant dampness aboard ship meant this accelerated cooling was not occasional, but chronic. Every sailor lived in a state of persistent heat loss, their bodies working constantly to replace what the damp air and wet fabric pulled away. Cold rose from the bilges. The lowest parts of the ship sat in standing water. Seawater that leaked through the hull, rainwater that seeped down, all of it collected at the bottom and stayed there between pumpings. This water, close to ocean temperature, chilled the wood around it. The cold spread upward through planks and beams. Sailors sleeping on the lowest deck, the orlop, felt this cold rising from beneath their hammocks. The very structure of the ship channeled cold upward from its submerged foundation. Pirates faced the same ocean as naval crews and merchant sailors, but they faced it with disadvantages that made survival harder. Their ships were often undermanned. A naval vessel of war carried a full complement, sometimes more men than strictly necessary. A merchant ship carried enough hands to work the vessel safely. A pirate ship operated with whoever remained after the last fight, whoever had not deserted at the last port, whoever had survived disease and accident. Fewer bodies meant less collective warmth in the sleeping quarters. It meant longer watches and shorter rest periods. It meant exhaustion that made cold penetrate deeper. The ships themselves were rarely ideal. Pirates took what they could capture. A vessel seized in battle became their new home regardless of its condition or suitability. If a ship lacked proper provisions for cold weather, pirates could not simply order more. If the hold contained insufficient wool blankets, if the previous crew had been undermanned, and the remaining stores were meager, the pirates inherited these deficiencies. They sailed in whatever they had stolen, adapted to whatever they had taken, and made do with whatever remained in the lockers. Caribbean waters promised warmth, but getting there was not simple. A pirate crew operating off the North American coast might flee northward to escape pursuit. A raid gone wrong might send them into colder waters than they had planned. Weather might force them off their intended route. The fugitive nature of their existence meant they could not always choose their path. They went where safety lay, where pursuers were not, where their damaged ship could reach. Sometimes this meant sailing through cold they had not prepared for. No safe harbor meant no recovery time. A naval crew returned to port. Periodically, they went ashore. They slept in barracks. They dried their clothes properly. They recovered from the accumulated stress of weeks at sea. Merchant sailors had home ports, scheduled stops, legitimate harbors where they could rest. Pirates had none of this. Every port was dangerous. Every anchorage risked betrayal. Many stayed at sea for months, never fully recovering from cold exposure, never truly warming, accumulating the damage that chronic cold inflicted on the body. The stress of being hunted added its own toll. Sleep came harder when any sail on the horizon might be a warship. The body's ability to regulate temperature suffered under chronic stress. Cortisol disrupted normal warming mechanisms. Anxiety burned calories the body needed for heat production. Fear kept muscles tense, which generated some warmth but also accelerated exhaustion. Pirates slept with the knowledge that capture meant hanging. This knowledge followed them into their hammocks and made the dark hours colder. Prize vessels were not always well maintained. A ship captured from a negligent merchant might have leaking decks, gaps in the hull planking, worn rigging. Pirates repaired what they could, but their repairs were makeshift. Proper shipyard work was impossible. A leaking deck meant more water below. Gaps in hull planking meant more drafts. These imperfections, minor in warm waters, became serious problems in cold conditions. The ship's ability to provide even minimal shelter degraded further. Provisions ran short. Pirates could not simply purchase supplies. They took what they captured, traded in shadow markets, or went without. If their raids failed to yield wool clothing, they wore what they had until it fell apart. If they captured a ship with no spare blankets, they slept with insufficient covering. The irregular nature of supply meant chronic shortages of exactly the items that would have made cold nights more bearable. The knowledge that warmer waters lay ahead was both comfort and torment. A pirate crew enduring a cold Atlantic crossing knew the Caribbean waited. They knew that if they survived the journey, warm nights would return. This knowledge helped them endure, but it also made each cold night feel more unjust. The warmth existed. It was real. It was simply elsewhere. They had to suffer through the cold to reach it, and there was no certainty they would survive long enough to feel tropical air again. Young bodies filled pirate crews. Most were in their 20s, some younger. Youth provided resilience, but also meant less experience in enduring cold. A veteran sailor knew techniques for managing hypothermia, recognized the early signs of frostbite, understood how to pace his body's heat production through a long night. A young pirate learned these things through suffering. Some learned fast enough. Others accumulated damage before they understood what was happening to them. The romantic image of pirate life included none of this. Stories spoke of treasure and freedom, not of shivering in damp wool while the Atlantic wind searched for warmth to steal. The reality was wooden ships and cold water and wind that never stopped. Pirates were not exempt from these realities. If anything, their circumstances made survival harder. They were fugitives on undermanned ships with irregular supplies, fleeing into whatever waters offered escape, sleeping in whatever they could steal, enduring cold that had no end date and no promise of relief. There was one material that made survival possible, one fiber that sailors trusted above all others: wool. It came from sheep raised on cold hillsides across England, Scotland, Ireland. The animals grew thick fleeces to survive wet winters and Atlantic winds. That same protection transferred to the men who wore it at sea. Wool became the foundation of every sailor's defense against cold. Without it, nights in northern waters would have been nearly impossible to endure. The fiber possessed qualities that seemed almost magical to those whose lives depended on staying warm in dampness. Wool retained heat even when soaked. This single property separated it from every other common fabric of the era. Linen turned cold and clammy when wet. Cotton collapsed and clung miserably to skin. But wool maintained its structure. The crimped fibers created tiny air pockets that trapped warmth close to the body. Water might penetrate the outer surface, but those inner spaces remained insulating. Man could be drenched by spray and still feel wool's protection working beneath the wet exterior. The natural oils made the difference. Lanolin coated each fiber as it grew on the sheep. This waxy substance repelled water to some degree. Droplets beaded on the surface rather than soaking through immediately. More importantly, lanolin helped the wool spring back after compression. The fabric didn't mat down and lose its loft the way other materials did. Even after weeks at sea, even after salt spray and constant wear, wool maintained enough structure to continue trapping warmth. Sailors understood this through experience rather than science. They knew wool worked. They knew it kept them alive. That knowledge passed from older hands to younger ones. Wear wool. Keep it on. Layer it thick. Trust it when nothing else helps. The clothing itself came from various sources. Many sailors purchased garments before sailing, visiting shops near the docks where merchants sold items specifically suited to sea life. Others bought from the ship's supplies, called slops. These were basic wool pieces kept in the purser's stores, Loose-fitting shirts, thick stockings, knitted caps, simple waistcoats. The slop chest served sailors who arrived with inadequate clothing or whose garments wore out during long voyages. The cost came from their wages, deducted over time, but the expense was worthwhile. Proper wool meant the difference between enduring cold and suffering dangerously from it. The quality varied. Fine wool from established weavers cost more but lasted longer and provided better warmth. Cheaper wool was coarser, more likely to cause itching, but it still insulated. Pirates wearing stolen or purchased garments had less control over quality than naval sailors issued standardized slops. But even rough wool served its essential purpose. The fiber's basic properties remained regardless of grade. Color mattered little. Most wool worn at sea was undyed or came in natural shades: grays, browns, off-whites. Some garments were blue, achieved through indigo dye that had become standard for certain naval items. The color made no difference to warmth. What mattered was thickness, weave density, and how many layers a man could wear. The wool had to be maintained through constant use. Sailors wore the same garments day after day. Washing was rare, fresh water was too precious to spare for laundry, and salt water didn't clean effectively. The wool gradually accumulated salt from spray, sweat, and the general dampness of shipboard life. This salt stiffened the fabric somewhat, and it also drew moisture from the air, keeping the wool perpetually damp even without direct wetting. But the insulation continued functioning. The fiber structure persisted through all of this. Repairs became necessary as wool wore thin at elbows, knees, and any point of frequent friction. Sailors with needlework skills patched their own garments. Others traded favors or small amounts of money to have shipmates make repairs. A torn shirt still provided warmth if the hole was mended. A stocking with a darned heel still protected the foot. Nothing was discarded while it could still serve. The wool stayed on their bodies through cold nights. Sailors rarely changed for sleep. The clothing they worked in became the clothing they slept in. This practice added warmth during the vulnerable hours below deck. It also meant readiness. If the watch called all hands to manage sudden weather, there was no delay for dressing. You rose from your hammock already clothed, but the warmth benefit mattered more during freezing nights. Every layer counted. The feeling of wool against skin became so familiar that sailors barely noticed it. The slight itch, the heaviness when wet, the smell of lanolin mixing with sweat and salt. These sensations were simply the texture of life at sea. The wool became a second skin, worn until it fell apart, then replaced with more wool. The cycle continued for as long as a man followed the ocean. Wool made the difference between cold and hypothermia, between discomfort and danger. The fiber couldn't make the nights warm, but it made them survivable. That was enough. The wardrobe of a sailor preparing for cold was built in stages. Each piece served a specific purpose. Together, they created a system of warmth that could be adjusted as conditions demanded. The foundation layer began with long wool shirts. These reached to mid-thigh and had long sleeves. The fabric sat directly against skin. This layer absorbed sweat during work and provided the first barrier of insulation during rest. The shirt's length mattered. It could be tucked into breeches to prevent cold air from reaching the lower back and stomach. Some sailors wore two shirts, one over the other, when conditions turned particularly bitter. Over the shirt came the waistcoat. This sleeveless garment added thickness across the torso, without restricting arm movement. Waistcoats were typically made of heavier wool than shirts. They buttoned up the front, allowing for quick venting if work made a man too warm. During sleep, the waistcoat stayed fastened, trapping heat around the core, where the body's vital organs required protection most. The layered construction, shirt, then waistcoat, created air spaces between fabrics. Those spaces held warmth more effectively than a single thick garment would. Breeches covered the legs from waist to just below the knee. These were also wool, often thick and slightly loose to allow for layering underneath. The fit couldn't be too tight. Restriction of blood flow led to colder extremities. The breeches were held up with drawstrings or simple buttons. They represented another segment of the body shielded from direct cold. Stockings completed the leg covering. These were knitted wool, pulled up over the calves to meet the breeches. The stockings were often thick enough to be slightly clumsy. But that thickness mattered during cold nights. Sailors knew that feet and lower legs being farthest from the heart grew cold quickly. Heavy stockings slowed that process. Some men wore two pairs when they could afford or obtain them. The inner pair might be thinner, the outer pair thick and coarse. Together they added substantial insulation. The head required its own protection. Knitted wool caps were universal among sailors. These fit snugly and could be pulled down to cover the ears. Heat escaped rapidly from an uncovered head. Sailors understood this even without modern explanations of body heat loss. The cap stayed on during sleep. Some men wore two caps layered together on the coldest nights. Others wrapped wool scarves around their heads and necks before sleeping, adding another barrier against heat loss. Neck cloths served multiple functions. During day work, they absorbed sweat and protected the neck from sun. During cold nights, they became insulators for one of the body's most vulnerable areas. The throat and neck contained blood vessels close to the surface. Cold penetrating there chilled blood flowing to the brain and body core. A thick wool scarf wrapped snugly made a measurable difference in overall warmth retention. Many sailors tied these cloths tightly before climbing into their hammocks. Hands presented a difficult challenge. Gloves interfered with rope work, and most sailors worked barehanded during the day regardless of cold. But at night, hands could be protected. Some men had fingerless wool mitts that covered palms and wrists while leaving fingers free. Others simply tucked their hands inside their shirts or waistcoats while sleeping, using their own body heat and the trapped warmth of layered clothing to keep fingers from going numb. The system worked through adjustment. A sailor working hard during the day might strip down to shirt and breeches, storing waistcoat and extra layers. But as evening approached and activity decreased, the layers went back on. By the time a man climbed into his hammock, he wore every piece he owned. The weight of all that wool was considerable, but weight didn't matter when you were lying down. Warmth mattered. Nothing was waterproof. Spray and rain penetrated eventually, but the layering slowed the process. The outer garments took the brunt of wetting. The inner layers stayed drier longer. And because wool insulated even when damp, the system continued functioning through levels of moisture that would have made linen or cotton useless. The layers also accommodated different body types and personal tolerance for cold. Younger sailors with faster metabolisms might need fewer layers. Older men with less body mass added more. Thin sailors layered heavily. Those with more natural insulation wore less. Each man learned his own needs through cold experience. Changing clothes was rare. The layers stayed on for days or weeks at a time. Salt, sweat, and grime accumulated. The wool took on the smell of the man wearing it. But washing meant using precious fresh water, and drying meant time in air that was rarely dry. So the clothes stayed on, building up their coating of salt and oil, slowly wearing thinner at stress points, but continuing to provide the warmth that made survival possible. The sailor's layered wardrobe was not complex or sophisticated. It was practical adaptation using available materials. Wool, fitted loosely, stacked in multiple pieces, covering as much skin as possible. This approach had evolved over centuries of cold weather sailing. It worked well enough that men continued using it. And on freezing nights far from land, when wind howled through rigging and spray froze on deck, those layers meant the difference between waking cold or not waking at all. The wool layers beneath protected the body, but the ocean itself still needed to be kept away. The spray that came over the rail, the rain that fell from low clouds for hours without pause, the green water that swept across the deck when waves met the bow at certain angles. All of it was cold. All of it soaked through ordinary fabric within moments, and so sailors wore something else on the outside, something that turned water away before it could reach the wool underneath. They called it a tarpaulin jacket. Sometimes just a tar jacket. The name told you what it was. Canvas cloth, heavy and thick, painted or soaked in tar until it became something closer to armor than clothing. The tar sealed the weave of the fabric. Water hit the surface and ran off instead of soaking through. It was not complicated. It was not comfortable. But it worked. The tar made the canvas stiff. A new jacket stood almost by itself when you set it down. The fabric did not bend easily at the elbows or shoulders. You put it on and felt the resistance immediately. The sleeves held their shape. The body of the jacket creaked slightly when you moved. It was like wearing a shell. That was the point. The shell kept the ocean outside while your body stayed dry within. The color was dark, black or deep brown, depending on the tar used. Some jackets showed streaks where the coating had been applied unevenly. Others were nearly uniform, painted carefully over multiple sessions until every thread was sealed. The process took time. A sailor might spend an afternoon treating a canvas jacket, working the tar into the fabric with a brush or rag, letting it dry, then applying another coat. 3 or 4 layers created a proper barrier. The smell never left. Tar had a thick, pungent odor that clung to everything. When you wore the jacket, you smelled it constantly. When you stored it below deck, it filled the space around your hammock. Other sailors could tell who wore a tar jacket even in the dark, just by the scent. It was sharp and chemical, mixed with the slight sweetness of the pine or coal tar used. Not pleasant, but familiar, and far better than being soaked. The weight was considerable. Canvas alone was heavy fabric, woven thick to withstand wear. Add the tar, and the jacket became heavier still, 5 or 6 pounds, sometimes more. You felt it on your shoulders the moment you pulled it on. Over a long watch, the weight added to your fatigue. But again, this was not a garment chosen for comfort. It was chosen because it kept you dry, and staying dry meant staying warmer when the temperature dropped and the wind picked up after sunset. The tar coating did not last forever. Sunlight broke it down slowly. Constant flexing at joints cracked the surface. Salt spray worked into the cracks and weakened the seal. After months of use, a jacket needed retreatment. You could see when this was necessary. The fabric lost its sheen. Water no longer beat it and ran off. Instead, it darkened the canvas, soaking in at worn spots. A sailor who cared for his gear watched for these signs and applied fresh tar before the protection failed completely. Not every sailor owned a tar jacket. They were personal items, not ship's property. You bought one in port or made one yourself if you had the materials. Pirates often took them from captured vessels. A merchant sailor's well-maintained tar jacket was valuable loot, more useful than silver in some ways because it could not be spent, but it kept you alive. A pirate crew that took a merchant ship would strip the sailors of their outer gear before setting them adrift or releasing them. This was understood, practical, not cruelty, just necessity. The quality varied. A jacket made by a careful sailor with good canvas and proper tar was a reliable piece of equipment. One made hastily, with thin fabric or insufficient coating, failed quickly. Pirates with stolen jackets wore whatever they had taken, which meant a crew showed a mixture of conditions. Some men wore stiff, well-sealed jackets. Others wore cracked, failing ones that let water through. The difference showed on their faces after a night watch in freezing rain. The jacket covered the torso and arms. Some extended to mid-thigh, offering protection to the upper legs. Others ended at the waist, leaving the legs covered by wool trousers alone. There were no standard patterns. Each jacket was made to available materials and personal preference. Most had simple closures, buttons carved from wood or bone, or ties made of tarred cord. Complicated fastenings were avoided. You needed to get the jacket on and off quickly, and cold fingers could not manage intricate work. Underneath the tar jacket, you wore all your wool. The jacket trapped the warmth those inner layers generated. It also trapped your body's moisture, your sweat, your breath. The tar coating worked both ways. It kept ocean water out, but it also kept your own dampness in. Over a long watch, you felt this. The wool beneath became damp not from rain, but from your own heat. This was a trade. You stayed warmer than you would have without the jacket, but you were never completely dry either. When you went below to sleep, you faced a choice. Keep the jacket on and retain its warmth, or remove it and gain freedom of movement in your hammock. Most sailors removed the jacket. The below-deck spaces were sheltered from wind and spray, and the jacket's stiffness made it difficult to settle comfortably in a swaying hammock. You hung it nearby or draped it over your sea chest or wedged it somewhere it would not slide away as the ship moved. In the morning, or when the watch changed in the middle of the night, you pulled it on again before going up to face the deck. The jacket became part of your identity. Sailors who wore tar jackets were called tarpaulins. The word for the gear became the word for the men. It marked you as someone who worked on deck, who faced the weather directly. It separated you from officers who stayed drier and from landsmen who had never needed such protection. The jacket was proof of your experience. A man wearing a well-worn tar jacket had been to sea long enough to know what mattered. But it was still just canvas and tar. It kept water off your skin. It held in some warmth. It gave you a better chance when the temperature dropped and the ocean hurled itself across the deck in freezing sheets. That was all it could do. The cold still found ways through. The wind still pulled heat away. The jacket was one more layer in the constant effort to survive the night. Essential, but not sufficient. Never sufficient by itself. You did not undress for sleep. This was one of the first things a new sailor learned. On land, you might remove your outer garments before bed, loosen your shirt, take off your shoes, settle into blankets in relative comfort. At sea, you did not have that luxury. You slept in what you wore, all of it. And there were good reasons this was necessary. The watch system meant you were never far from being called back to duty. 4 hours of sleep at most, often less. When the bell rang or a voice shouted down into the darkness, you needed to be on deck immediately, not in a minute, not after you found your shoes and pulled on your shirt. Immediately. Ships did not wait. Weather did not pause while you dressed. If you slept without your clothes, you would waste precious seconds. Seconds that could mean the difference between a sail properly handled and a sail lost, between a ship that answered the helm and a ship that broached in a following sea. So you kept everything on. Your wool stockings, your long shirt, your waistcoat, your trousers, even your shoes or the wrapped cloth you used for footwear. You lay down in your hammock fully dressed, and when you woke, by choice or by command, you were ready. You climbed out of the hammock and headed straight for the ladder. This was the routine. This was how it worked. But there was another reason beyond readiness. The clothing itself provided warmth. Every layer you wore while sleeping was another barrier between your skin and the cold air. The ship's interior was not heated. You have already learned this. The below-deck spaces were warmer than the open deck, but they were not warm. The temperature might be 40 degrees while the deck above was 30. That difference mattered, but 40 degrees was still cold when you were trying to sleep. The wool you wore during the day became your bedding at night. This meant you went to your hammock already insulated. The layers that had kept you functional during your watch now kept you functional during your rest. Your body generated heat always, continuously, as long as you lived and ate and breathed. That heat would have escaped quickly through bare skin into cold air. But with wool covering your arms, your legs, your torso, the heat stayed closer. It built up in the space between fabric and skin, not enough to make you comfortable, enough to keep you from freezing. The hammock itself was canvas, and you wrapped it around yourself as you settled in. This added another layer over your clothing, so the structure became your skin, your wool layers, the canvas hammock enclosing you. 3 barriers against the cold, none of them thick, none of them particularly effective alone, but together they were sufficient for survival. Some men added their jackets to the arrangement, not wearing them but draping them over the hammock as a blanket. A tar jacket laid across your body added weight and a bit more insulation. If you had a wool coat, something heavier than a waistcoat, you might use that instead. Or in addition, you used whatever you had. There was no shame in this. No one mocked another sailor for piling on extra layers. Everyone understood. Your head needed covering. Heat escaped rapidly from an uncovered head, even when the rest of you was wrapped, so you kept your knitted cap on, pulled down over your ears. Sometimes you pulled it low enough to cover your eyebrows, leaving just your face exposed. If it was particularly cold, you might wrap a piece of cloth around your neck and lower face, breathing through the fabric. This warmed the air slightly before it entered your lungs, and it kept the moisture of your breath close to your skin instead of losing it to the surrounding air. Your hands were difficult. You needed them exposed and functional if you were called to deck, but they grew cold quickly while you slept. Some men tucked their hands inside their shirts against their ribs or under their armpits, where body heat was strongest. Others kept their hands outside but curled them into fists, minimizing the surface area exposed to air. There was no perfect solution. Your hands were simply going to be cold. You accepted this. The problem with sleeping fully clothed was that nothing ever aired out. The wool absorbed your sweat during the day. Then you slept in it, and your body's warmth during the night released more moisture into the fabric. The dampness never fully left. Over days and weeks, the clothing became saturated with salt and body oils and the general humidity of sea air. It began to smell. It became stiff in places. It chafed against skin that was already raw from constant exposure to salt water. You could not wash the clothes properly. Fresh water was too precious to waste on laundry. Sometimes during a rain squall, men would strip and let the rain rinse them and their clothing at once. But this was rare, and it required relatively warm weather. In cold conditions, getting wet, even with fresh water, was dangerous. So you wore the same wool day and night, week after week, and it slowly degraded. Pirates had it worse. A naval vessel might issue replacement slops, basic clothing from ship stores, when a sailor's gear became too worn. Merchant ships sometimes did the same, deducting the cost from wages. But pirate ships had no such system. You wore what you had until it fell apart. Then you replaced it with whatever you could take from a captured vessel or buy in a port that would trade with you. This meant pirate crews wore a mixture of clothing types and qualities, and some men had far better gear than others. If you were fortunate enough to take a well-supplied merchant ship, you might find a sailor aboard whose build matched yours, and you would take his spare clothes along with his current ones. If you took a passenger ship, you might find a gentleman's wool coat that could be altered to fit. These were prizes as valuable as coin. You could not eat them, but they kept you alive through cold nights, which was its own kind of wealth. The routine became automatic. Finish your watch, climb below. Find your hammock in the darkness. Climb in without removing anything. Wrap the canvas around yourself. Pull your arms inside your shirt for extra warmth. Tuck your chin down. Close your eyes. Sleep as deeply as exhaustion allowed until the next call came. You did not think about it anymore. You did not wish for different arrangements. This was simply how sleep happened at sea. Fully clothed, minimally comfortable, always ready. The clothes you stood watch in were the clothes you slept in, were the clothes you woke in. They were the barrier between your skin and the cold that never stopped pressing in from every direction. You might imagine that sailors, after days at sea, would find a way to dry their clothing, that they would hang garments near whatever warmth existed, or rotate between wet and dry sets, or wait for sun and wind to evaporate the moisture that clung to every thread. But this was not the reality aboard wooden ships in the open ocean. Nothing dried completely. The damp was permanent. The air itself carried moisture. Salt spray rose from waves that broke against the hull, and that spray settled on everything: ropes, wood, canvas, cloth. It worked its way into fibers. When seawater dried, it left salt crystals behind. These crystals drew moisture back out of the air, keeping fabric perpetually damp, even when no new water touched it. A wool shirt soaked in spray might lose the dripping wetness, but it would never return to the dry state it had known on land. The salt prevented it. This meant that every piece of clothing a sailor wore carried some degree of moisture at all times. The wool cap on his head, the stockings on his feet, the shirt against his skin, the waistcoat layered over it. All of them held water in their fibers, and that water conducted cold directly to his body. Wet fabric steals heat far more efficiently than dry fabric. It pulls warmth away from skin through conduction, turning the body's own heat into a resource that escapes rather than one that accumulates. Salt made the problem worse in ways beyond moisture retention. When seawater dried on fabric, the remaining salt crystals turned soft wool stiff. A shirt that had once draped comfortably became scratchy and rigid. Stockings grew rough against skin. The salt worked its way into the weave of the cloth, and with each subsequent wetting and drying, more salt accumulated. Layers of it built up over weeks at sea, transforming garments into something closer to sandpaper than fabric. This stiffness and roughness caused constant chafing. Skin rubbed raw at the points where clothing moved with the body: underarms, inner thighs, around the neck, at the wrists. The abrasion created small wounds, and those wounds, exposed to salt and unable to dry, became painful irritations that never fully healed while at sea. A sailor's skin, beneath his layers of supposedly protective clothing, was often a map of raw patches and persistent soreness. The dampness penetrated in ways that dry cold never could. Dry air, even frigid air, can be blocked by layers of fabric that trap still air between them. But wet fabric collapses. The fibers stick together. The air pockets disappear. What should have been insulating layers become instead cold, heavy wrappings that conduct rather than protect. A sailor wearing 5 layers of damp wool might be colder than one wearing 2 layers of dry fabric, but dry fabric was a luxury that did not exist. At night, this reality became harder to escape. During the day, a sailor moved. He climbed rigging, hauled ropes, scrubbed decks, worked the capstan. Movement generated heat, and even though damp clothes stole that heat away, the body produced enough through labor to maintain some warmth. But at night, lying still in a hammock, there was no movement to generate heat. There was only the body's resting metabolism and the damp fabric wrapped around it, quietly pulling warmth away. The sailors knew this. They understood that their clothing would never be dry. They accepted it the way they accepted wind and waves, as a condition of the environment that could not be changed. There was no point in complaints. No amount of wishing would evaporate the moisture from a wool shirt when the air itself was saturated with salt spray and ocean humidity. Some tried to minimize the problem. A sailor might, if he had a spare shirt, keep one tucked deep in his sea chest, wrapped in canvas, protected from spray. He would save this for the coldest nights, pulling it out only when temperatures dropped low enough to justify using his reserve. But even this shirt, stored as carefully as conditions allowed, would gradually absorb moisture from the air. The sea chest was not airtight. The wood itself was damp. Nothing aboard the ship escaped the water. Others learned to wring out their stockings before sleep, twisting the wool to force out as much seawater as possible. This helped slightly. A wrung-out stocking was less cold than one still dripping. But wringing required effort, and at the end of a watch, after 4 hours of work in freezing wind, many sailors lacked the energy for even this small task. They simply climbed into their hammocks, wearing whatever they had worn on deck, damp and salt-stiffened and cold. The skin adapted, but only partially. After weeks at sea, a sailor's hands grew tougher, more resistant to the constant moisture. His feet developed thick calluses, but skin could only toughen so much. It remained vulnerable to the abrasion of salt-stiff fabric, to the cold that wet cloth conducted, to the infections that crept into raw patches and refused to heal in the damp environment. This was the truth beneath the layers. The wool, the canvas, the carefully constructed wardrobe of a sailor, all of it existed in a state of permanent dampness that made cold penetrate deeper than it ever could on land. The clothing still mattered. It still provided crucial insulation, even wet. Wet wool was far better than no wool, but it was never comfortable, never dry, never the protective barrier that a landlubber might imagine. The sailors wore their damp, salt-crusted clothing through freezing nights because there was no alternative. They slept in it, worked in it, lived in it. And they survived, their bodies maintaining enough warmth to endure, but never enough to be truly comfortable. The wet was simply part of the cold, inseparable from it, another element of the environment they could not control, and had learned not to fight. The hammock was not a comfort. It was a solution to problems that had no other answer aboard a wooden ship. Before hammocks became standard, sailors slept on deck or on platforms in the hold. They lay on wood or on coiled rope or on whatever surface the ship provided. This meant sleeping on surfaces that were always damp, often wet, sometimes covered in seawater that had leaked through or washed aboard. It meant waking to find yourself soaked, or discovering that the deck had tilted during the night and rolled you against a bulkhead. It meant cold rising directly from the wood into your body, with nothing to interrupt the transfer of heat from flesh to timber. The hammock solved this by suspending the sleeper in air. It was a simple technology, a rectangle of canvas, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, with rope worked through grommets at each end. The ropes gathered together and tied to hooks mounted in the overhead beams. When hung properly, the hammock created a cocoon that hung several feet above the deck, swaying gently with the ship's motion. This suspension was critical for warmth. Air, even cold air, insulates better than direct contact with a cold surface. A sailor in a hammock did not lie against wet wood. He hung in space, with air beneath him and the canvas of the hammock, as a barrier between his body and the cold deck below. This alone made hammocks warmer than sleeping on the deck, even without any other advantage. But the hammock offered more than separation from the deck. The canvas itself, when the sailor settled into it, wrapped around his body. Hammocks were designed to be slightly narrower than a person lying flat, which meant that when you lay in one, the sides curved up and around you. You did not lie on top of the hammock. You settled into it, and it enclosed you. This enclosure created a pocket. The canvas formed walls on either side of your body, trapping the air you warmed with your own heat. When you wrapped a blanket over yourself while lying in a hammock, the combination of canvas below and wool above created a surprisingly effective barrier against the cold air of the lower deck. The hammock became a kind of fabric cave, a personal space that held warmth better than an open sleeping platform ever could. The motion of the hammock, which seemed like it would be a disadvantage, turned out to help. The gentle swaying matched the rhythm of the ship's movement through water. For sailors accustomed to the constant motion of a vessel at sea, this rocking became soothing. It did not keep them awake. Instead, it lulled them toward sleep, the way a cradle rocks an infant. Landlubbers found the motion disturbing, but experienced sailors reported that they slept poorly in still beds on shore, missing the familiar sway. Hammocks also compressed. When a sailor climbed in and settled, the canvas pulled tight beneath him, conforming to his body's shape. This compression brought all his clothing layers into close contact with his skin, eliminating air gaps where warmth could escape. The hammock forced his wool shirt, his waistcoat, his jacket, and whatever blanket he had into a unified mass that held heat against him rather than allowing it to dissipate. A sailor could increase this effect by wrapping himself more tightly. Some would pull a corner of the hammock's canvas over their upper body, creating an extra layer. Others tucked the edges of their blanket underneath themselves, sealing in the warmth. The hammock's flexibility allowed each man to adjust his cocoon to match the night's temperature and his own tolerance for confinement. The canvas used for hammocks was heavy, the same material used for sails, thick and tightly woven. This weight was an advantage in cold weather. The fabric itself provided a substantial barrier to drafts. Wind moving through the lower deck, seeking every gap and opening, was blocked by the hammock's canvas in a way it would not have been blocked by a thin blanket alone. Hammocks kept sailors dry, or at least drier than the alternative. When leaks developed in the deck above, or when waves broke over the rail and water seeped below, it ran across the deck and collected in low spots. A sailor on the deck would have lain in that water, soaking his clothing further and losing heat rapidly. But a sailor in a hammock hung above it, untouched by the water pooling beneath him. The hooks that supported hammocks were positioned with care. They mounted into the ship's beams, strong points in the structure that could bear a man's weight, even in rough seas. The spacing of these hooks was standardized, typically 14 to 16 inches between each hammock when hung. This tight spacing meant that rows of hammocks filled the available space efficiently, packing the maximum number of sleepers into the area below deck. This compression of bodies, which would seem like pure misery, served a function in cold weather. When hammocks hung so close that you could reach out and touch the sailor beside you, the warmth radiating from neighboring bodies added to your own. Each hammock was suspended in air, but that air was shared with dozens of other sailors, all of them exhaling warm breath, all of them radiating body heat. The space between the hammocks became warmer than open air would have been. The hammock was not comfortable by any standard a modern person would recognize. The canvas was rough. The position forced the body into a slight curve that some found awkward. Getting in and out required a practiced motion, a kind of rolling fall into the hammock, and a careful extraction that avoided dumping yourself onto the deck. But comfort was not the measure of a hammock's value. Survival was. A hammock kept you off the wet deck. It wrapped around you. It trapped your body heat. It swayed with the ship in a rhythm that encouraged sleep despite cold and discomfort. It packed you close enough to your shipmates that their warmth became yours, and it could be rolled up and stowed during the day, freeing the space below deck for other uses. These functions made the hammock more than just a place to sleep. It was a piece of survival equipment as essential as a wool coat or a waterproof jacket. In the contest between a sailor's body and the freezing nights at sea, the hammock was one of the few advantages the sailor possessed. It did not make the nights warm, but it made them survivable. The hammocks hung in rows that left no empty air between them. 14 inches separated one canvas bed from the next, sometimes 16 inches, never more. A sailor lying on his back could extend his arm and touch the man sleeping beside him without effort. This proximity was not accidental. It was essential. The ship's designers understood what they were creating. A wooden vessel carried perhaps 80 men, sometimes more. All of them needed sleep. All of them needed space that did not exist. The solution hung from the deck beams in tightly packed rows that turned individual sailors into a collective source of warmth. Each man generated heat simply by being alive. The body burned food for fuel. It maintained its core temperature through constant internal combustion. That heat radiated outward. In open air, wind carried it away before it could accumulate. In the narrow gap between hammocks, it had nowhere to go. A sailor climbed into his canvas bed and wrapped the fabric around himself. The hammock became a cocoon. His body warmed the air trapped inside that cocoon. But the canvas was not thick. Heat passed through it. The man in the next hammock, 14 inches away, felt that warmth crossing the small distance. His own body added to it. The man on the other side did the same. The effect multiplied along the entire row. 20 hammocks hanging in sequence created a corridor of human warmth. No single sailor generated enough heat to matter. 20 sailors, pressed close by necessity, created an environment degrees warmer than the air at either end of the row. The arrangement required tolerance. A man's face hung close enough to his neighbor that he could hear every breath, every grunt of discomfort, every muttered word in sleep. Bodies shifted in the night. Hammocks swayed with the ship's motion. They bumped against each other. Canvas rubbed canvas. The proximity that created warmth also eliminated privacy completely. But privacy held no value against cold. A sailor who demanded space for himself would hang his hammock farther from the others. He would claim that extra distance as a privilege. He would spend the night shivering in isolation, while men packed together slept in relative warmth. The lesson taught itself quickly. The tightest rows existed on the berth deck where most crew slept. Hammocks filled the available space from bulkhead to bulkhead. Walking between them required turning sideways. A man carrying anything had to wait until hammocks were stowed before he could pass through. At night, the deck transformed into a solid mass of hanging canvas with barely enough room between rows for a person to stand. That density created warmth that open arrangements could not match. 80 men breathing in an enclosed space raised the temperature of that space. Their exhalations added moisture to the air. That moisture carried heat. The deck beams above them grew slightly warm from the collected body heat rising upward. The air itself became a shared resource, heated and reheated by passage through living lungs. The canvas hammocks contributed to the effect. The fabric held heat against the body rather than allowing it to dissipate freely. When a sailor wrapped himself tightly, he created a barrier between his warmth and the cold air. But canvas was thin. Some heat escaped. That escaping heat warmed the sailor in the next hammock, who returned the favor with his own body's output. New sailors sometimes resisted the closeness. They came from lives ashore, where sleeping arrangements allowed distance between people. The hammock rows felt suffocating. They requested positions at the end of a row where at least one side offered open air. They learned their error within a few cold nights. The men who had served longest claimed the center positions. They hung their hammocks in the middle of the longest rows, surrounded on both sides by other sleepers. These positions received warmth from multiple directions. They stayed several degrees warmer than hammocks at the row's end, where cold air from the deck's edges could reach them. The system worked because every man participated. A single empty hammock in a row created a gap in the collective warmth. Cold air filled that gap. The sailors on either side of the absence felt the difference immediately. They lost the heat that should have come from a neighboring body. Their own hammocks grew colder. Ships at full crew strength stayed warmer than undermanned vessels. A pirate ship that had lost men in battle or disease suffered in multiple ways. Fewer hands to work the ship, fewer men to stand watch, and fewer bodies to generate warmth in the sleeping quarters. The remaining crew felt that absence most acutely on the coldest nights, when gaps in the hammock rows let precious heat escape into darkness. The hammocks themselves swayed with the ship's motion, but the motion kept them close together. A wave rolled beneath the hull. Every hammock swung in response. They moved as a group, maintaining their tight spacing even as they shifted. The canvas sides brushed against each other. The contact was constant, a tactile reminder that warmth required proximity. Some ships packed hammocks even closer than 14 inches. 16 inches became 14. 14 became 12. The sailors complained. They always complained, but they also understood. The closer they hung, the warmer they stayed. The mathematics were simple. The choice was none at all. A ship contained layers of space stacked vertically. Each layer had its own relationship with cold. The arrangement created a geography of warmth that every sailor learned to read. The upper deck lay open to sky and wind. No sailor slept there by choice in cold weather. The wood planking offered no shelter from moving air. A man resting on the upper deck lost heat as quickly as if he stood in an open field. Faster, because ocean wind carried moisture that drew warmth from skin and fabric without pause. Below the upper deck was the gun deck. This space held the ship's cannon. It had openings along both sides where the guns protruded. These gun ports allowed cannon fire during battle. They also allowed wind to sweep through the deck even when closed. The gun deck stayed barely warmer than the weather outside. Sailors passed through it to reach other parts of the ship. They did not linger there after dark. The berth deck sat below the gun deck. This was where most crew slept. It had fewer openings to the outside. The gun ports from the deck above did not extend down this far. The hull's wooden walls surrounded the space on all sides. Wind still reached this deck, but it had to travel down through hatches and companionways. By the time moving air arrived at the berth deck, it had lost some of its cutting force. More importantly, the berth deck was below the waterline. The ocean surrounded it. Water temperature stayed more stable than air temperature. Even in winter, seawater rarely froze. It held degrees of warmth that air did not. The wooden hull separated the berth deck from that water by only a few inches of planking. The ocean's relative warmth, cold by any human measure, but warmer than winter air, kept the berth deck from reaching the extreme temperatures found on upper decks. This was where most hammocks hung. The deck beams provided secure points for the rope ends. The enclosed space trapped the heat generated by sleeping bodies. A sailor on the berth deck benefited from the ocean's temperature stability below him and the mass of warm bodies around him. But below the berth deck was the orlop deck. This was the lowest deck in the ship, the darkest and most cramped. The name came from overlooping, meaning to overlap or cover. It sat beneath everything else. Most ships used it for storage, cable, rope, sailcloth, spare equipment. Anything that needed to stay dry but could tolerate darkness lived on the orlop deck. The orlop deck had no natural light, no portholes, no gun ports, no openings to the outside except the hatches leading down from above. A man standing there existed in near total darkness, even at midday. The air was thick. Movement was difficult because stored equipment filled most of the available space. Yet the orlop deck was the warmest place on the ship during cold weather. It sat deepest in the hull, farthest from the wind, most completely surrounded by water. The ocean's stable temperature affected it more than any other part of the vessel. The deck above, the berth deck full of sleeping sailors, added its warmth to the orlop ceiling. Heat rose. The warmth generated by 80 men sleeping overhead drifted downward through gaps in the planking, and collected in the orlop's enclosed space. No wind reached there. Air moved only when someone opened a hatch. The stillness allowed whatever warmth existed to accumulate rather than being swept away. The stored equipment created barriers that divided the orlop into smaller spaces. These divisions blocked what little air movement occurred, creating pockets where temperature rose slightly above the surrounding areas. Experienced sailors knew this. On the coldest nights, when even the berth deck felt brutally cold, some men abandoned their hammocks. They climbed down to the orlop deck. They found spaces between coiled cable and stacked canvas. They curled up in the darkness, trading light and comfort for a few extra degrees of warmth. The ship's center was warmer than its edges. A sailor sleeping in a hammock at the middle of the berth deck hung far from the hull's outer walls. Cold from the water outside had to travel through wood and air before reaching him. A sailor whose hammock hung near the hull felt that cold more directly. Only inches of planking separated him from ocean water. Similarly, positions away from hatches and companionways stayed warmer. Every opening in the deck structure allowed cold air to descend. The areas immediately around these openings became rivers of cold flowing downward. A hammock hung 3 feet from a companionway felt noticeably colder than one hung in a corner, far from any opening. Ships had varying layouts, but certain principles held across all vessels. Lower was warmer in winter. Central was warmer than peripheral. Enclosed was warmer than open. Distance from hatches mattered. Proximity to stored cargo helped because the cargo blocked air movement and provided insulation. Some ships had a small galley below deck. The cook's fire was extinguished at night for safety, but the brick structure that contained it retained heat for hours. The area around the galley stayed warmer than the rest of the deck. A hammock hung near the galley remained a prized position. Senior sailors claimed these spots. New crew members slept where they were told, often in the coldest positions until they gained enough standing to request better placement. The vertical geography created a temperature gradient. The masts rose from the orlop deck all the way through the upper deck to the open air. Cold descended through this channel. The bottom of the mast, where it passed through the orlop, stayed relatively warm. The top, exposed to wind and sky, grew cold enough to freeze a man's hands to the wood. Every foot of height represented a measurable drop in temperature. Sailors learned to navigate this geography. They knew which deck offered the best compromise between air quality and warmth. They knew which positions within each deck stayed warmest. They carried this knowledge from ship to ship, adapting it to each vessel's particular layout. The warmest spot on the entire ship during a cold night was probably a space on the orlop deck, centered between the masts, surrounded by stored cable, directly below the thickest concentration of sleeping hammocks, far from any hatch. A man who found such a spot and could tolerate the absolute darkness and foul air would sleep warmer than anyone else aboard. But most sailors accepted the berth deck as sufficient. The orlop's warmth came at a cost of breathable air and any possibility of quick movement if called to duty. The berth deck offered a workable balance, cold enough to be uncomfortable, warm enough to survive. Not every sleeping spot aboard a wooden ship offered the same chance of warmth through the night. Sailors learned this quickly. Within the first weeks at sea, a man understood which hammocks hung in drafts that never ceased, which spaces collected the dampness rising from the bilge, and which positions held onto whatever small warmth the ship contained. This knowledge was not written down. It passed from older sailors to younger ones, through observation, through cold nights spent in the wrong location, through the quiet claim of seniority when hammocks were assigned. The galley stood as the ship's only legitimate source of heat. Cooking fires burned there during daylight hours, contained in a firebox lined with brick, carefully managed and extinguished before nightfall. But brick held heat longer than wood. The iron cauldrons stayed warm to the touch for hours after the flames died. This residual warmth radiated into the surrounding space, not powerfully, but measurably. A hammock hung near the galley's wall might be only 2 or 3 degrees warmer than 120 feet away, but over the course of a frozen night, those degrees mattered. Men felt the difference in their bones. Experienced sailors claimed these positions through the unspoken hierarchy that governed life below deck. A man who had survived multiple winter crossings did not argue his case. He simply hung his hammock near the galley bulkhead, and younger sailors accepted this without protest. They knew their turn would come if they lived long enough, if they proved themselves capable, if they remained with the ship through seasons of hardship. Until then, they took what positions remained. The center of a row of hammocks offered advantages that seemed minor until a man spent weeks at sea. Each hammock hung 14 to 16 inches from its neighbors. The men sleeping on either side created barriers against moving air. Their bodies generated heat that did not reach far, but reached far enough. A sailor sleeping in the middle of a full row had warm bodies to his left and right. The end positions, by contrast, faced open passages where cold air moved freely. Men assigned to the ends wrapped themselves more completely in their hammocks, pulled their wool caps lower, accepted that they would wake colder than their companions. Cargo created shelters within the lower decks. Barrels of salted pork stacked 3 high-formed walls that blocked drafts. Crates of ship's biscuit, sacks of flour, coils of spare rope. All of these materials interrupted the air currents that swept through the sleeping quarters. Sailors positioned their hammocks behind these barriers when possible. The cargo itself held no warmth, but it stopped the wind that stole warmth from living flesh. A wall of barrels 6 feet away might cut the draft by half. That was enough. On some voyages, ships carried livestock, pigs, chickens, sometimes a goat for milk. These animals lived in pens on deck during fair weather, but in storms or extreme cold, they were brought below to prevent them from freezing or being washed overboard. Animal bodies generated heat more efficiently than human bodies for their size. A pig radiating warmth in a pen near the crew's quarters raised the temperature of the surrounding air. Sailors recognized this and adjusted their hammock positions accordingly. The smell of livestock below deck was considerable, the noise disruptive, but warmth outweighed these discomforts. Men slept near pigs without complaint. The ship's structure itself created warmer and colder zones. Areas directly beneath hatchways faced exposure every time those hatches opened. Cold air poured down like water. Sections of the hull where caulking had failed admitted thin streams of frigid wind. The spaces near the bow, where the ship's motion was most violent, tended to be colder because the constant pitching disrupted any stable pocket of warmer air. Sailors learned to read these patterns. They noted which timbers sweated with condensation, which corners stayed relatively dry, which beams overhead dripped steadily through the night. Knowledge about sleeping positions accumulated through trial and observation. A sailor might spend his first voyage in whatever hammock space remained after others had chosen. He would wake repeatedly from the cold, shift position, pull his blanket tighter, and learn nothing except that he was miserable. But he watched. He noticed that the men who slept soundly through the night had not chosen their positions randomly. He asked questions, received brief answers, remembered. On his second voyage, he chose more carefully. By his third winter at sea, he knew exactly where to hang his hammock for the best chance of surviving the night without waking frozen. This selection process happened without formal organization. No officer assigned positions based on warmth efficiency. The crew sorted itself through experience and the respect afforded to men who had proven themselves. Conflicts rarely arose because the logic was clear to everyone. A sailor who had crossed the Atlantic 4 times in winter deserved the warmest spot. A boy on his first voyage did not. The difference between the warmest and coldest sleeping positions might be measured at only 5 or 6 degrees. In the physics of survival, this was substantial. A man maintaining body temperature at the threshold of comfort versus one slipping toward dangerous cold. This margin separated restful sleep from a night of shivering wakefulness. Sailors understood this practically, if not scientifically. They chose their positions with care, claimed better spots as they earned them, and accepted that the ship's hierarchy extended even to the geometry of warmth below deck. The orlop deck occupied the lowest level of a ship where men could stand, positioned below the waterline, beneath the gun deck on warships or the main cargo hold on merchant vessels. The name derived from old nautical language meaning overlop, a covering deck. This space received no natural light. No portholes pierced the hull at this depth. Men moved through the orlop by lantern light or memory. their heads often bent beneath beams too low for upright walking. The air here carried thickness, a quality of heaviness that came from poor circulation and the proximity of bilge water. Yet in winter, experienced sailors sought sleeping positions on the orlop deck despite its darkness and discomfort, because this lowest space held qualities that mattered more than light or fresh air. The orlop sat entirely below the waterline. The ocean surrounded it on all sides, separated only by the ship's hull planking. Water maintained more stable temperatures than air. Even in northern waters cold enough to form ice, the sea itself rarely dropped below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. This mass of relatively stable liquid insulated the orlop deck from the extreme temperature swings experienced on decks exposed to open air. When winter wind drove the surface air temperature down to zero, the orlop remained measurably warmer because the ocean's thermal mass buffered it. This principle worked both directions. In tropical heat, the orlop stayed cooler than upper decks, but its benefit was most apparent in cold weather. A sailor sleeping on the gun deck felt the full impact of nighttime temperature drops. A sailor sleeping on the orlop experienced temperatures moderated by the vast reservoir of water pressing against the hull just inches away. The difference might be 8 or 10 degrees. That difference was the margin between sleep and sleepless misery. The orlop's position at the bottom of the ship meant that whatever warmth existed anywhere in the vessel gradually settled there. Heat rises, but in the complex interior of a wooden ship, air currents carried warm air downward through hatchways and ladderways before it finally escaped through upper deck ventilation. The residual heat from the galley, the accumulated body heat from men working on deck, the slight warmth generated by lanterns, all of this eventually found its way to the orlop before dissipating. The effect was subtle but cumulative over the course of a night. Ventilation on the orlop was minimal by design. The deck had few openings, and those that existed were deliberately reduced in cold weather. Officers ordered hatchways partially sealed, gratings covered. This decision was made consciously, with full knowledge that the air would become foul. Men breathed the same air repeatedly. Condensation formed on every surface. The smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, bilge water, and tar became overwhelming. But warmth accumulated in poorly ventilated spaces. Sailors made the trade willingly. The orlop served multiple functions that added to its nighttime warmth. It housed the sail locker, where spare canvas was stored in large bins. The powder magazine occupied a section of the orlop on warships, carefully sealed and guarded. The surgeon's station was located here, along with storage for the ship's most valuable supplies: spare rigging, paint, the carpenter's materials, the bosun's reserves. All of these materials and their compartments created internal walls that further broken up air movement and formed pockets of relatively still air where warmth could settle. The deck's cramped dimensions meant bodies were closer together. Hammocks hung at the same 14 to 16-inch intervals as on other decks, but the orlop's lower ceiling and smaller total area meant fewer hammocks spread over less space. The density of sleeping men was effectively higher. Each body contributed its heat to a smaller volume of air. The result was measurable. Temperature readings taken at different deck levels during the age of sail consistently showed the orlop as warmest during winter nights, sometimes by significant margins. Men traded considerable discomfort for this warmth. The darkness was absolute without a lantern. A sailor waking in the night on the orlop could not see his own hand. The ceiling height required constant awareness to prevent head injuries on beams. The smell was genuinely terrible. The air felt thick in the lungs. Sounds carried strangely in the enclosed space: snoring, coughing, the creaking of the hull, the slosh of bilge water. Rats were more numerous here, bolder in the darkness. Yet sailors seeking the warmest possible sleeping position chose the orlop deliberately. Not every ship had sufficient orlop space for the entire crew to sleep there. Priority went to the men whose positions or seniority earned them the privilege, and to those judged most in need: sailors recovering from illness, older men whose bodies handled cold poorly, those showing signs of dangerous cold exposure. The orlop became an informal sick bay for men suffering from the accumulated effects of winter at sea, even though the surgeon's actual workspace occupied the same deck. The orlop's warmth was relative, not absolute. The temperature there might be 38 degrees when the gun deck was 30 and the weather deck was 22. These were still temperatures well below comfort, well below what modern humans would consider tolerable sleeping conditions. But survival operated on narrow margins. The Orlops' 8 extra degrees might prevent hypothermia. They might allow genuine sleep instead of shivering half-consciousness. For men spending months at sea through winter, that difference justified the oppressive darkness, the foul air, and the rats moving boldly in the spaces between hammocks. A sailor owned almost nothing. His entire life fit inside a wooden chest measuring perhaps 3 feet long, 18 inches deep. Inside that box, spare clothes if he had them, needles and thread for repair, perhaps a knife, a cup, letters from home that might never be answered, and if he was fortunate, a thin mattress and a blanket that could mean the difference between sleep and a night spent shivering in darkness. The mattress was called a donkey. The name came from its stuffing, coarse straw or horsehair packed into a canvas tick barely 2 inches thick when new. After weeks at sea, the stuffing compressed into a flat mat that offered little cushioning against the hammock's canvas. But cushioning was not its purpose. The donkey provided a thin layer of insulation between a man's body and the air circulating beneath the hammock. It trapped some warmth. It prevented body heat from radiating downward into the cold space below. The straw inside never stayed dry. Condensation from breath and body moisture seeped into the canvas. Salt air penetrated the weave. Within days of leaving port, every donkey aboard carried dampness that would not leave until the voyage ended. The straw inside began to rot slowly, giving off a musty smell that mixed with the general odor of the lower deck. Sailors accepted this. A damp, thin mattress still held more warmth than canvas alone. Some men had no donkey at all. They slept directly in their hammocks, their only padding the clothes on their backs. On pirate ships where provisions came from captured vessels, bedding might be plentiful after a successful raid, or completely absent during lean periods. A crew that took a merchant ship often divided the cargo blankets among themselves before anything else. Warmth was wealth. The blanket mattered more than the mattress. A good wool blanket, thick and tightly woven, became a sailor's most valued possession. He wrapped himself in it every night. He guarded it from theft with the same vigilance he guarded his rum ration. Men had fought over blankets. Men had killed over blankets, though that truth was rarely spoken aloud. Wool blankets came in different weights. A heavy blanket might weigh 8 or 10 pounds, woven so densely that wind could not penetrate its fibers. Lighter blankets traded thickness for easier handling, but provided less protection against deep cold. The best blankets were old ones, their wool softened by years of use, their weave slightly felted from countless washings in seawater. These blankets had proven themselves through previous voyages. They had kept other men alive. A sailor wrapped his blanket around his entire body, tucking the edges beneath himself to prevent cold air from entering. Some men wrapped themselves so completely they resembled canvas cocoons hanging in the darkness, only their faces exposed to breathe. Others kept their arms free, needing to feel unconstrained despite the cold. The method varied by individual preference, but every method aimed at the same goal: trap warm air close to the skin, prevent that air from escaping. The blanket grew damp just as the mattress did. Moisture from breathing accumulated in its folds. Sweat from the body soaked into the wool, but wool retained its insulating properties even when wet, and a damp blanket still held warmth through the night. In the morning, a sailor might hang his blanket from a line during his watch, hoping wind would dry it slightly before the next nightfall. It never dried completely. He wrapped himself in damp wool every night and called himself fortunate to have it. On naval vessels, officers received multiple blankets. The captain might sleep beneath 3 or 4 layers of fine wool. Common sailors received 1 blanket if they received any at all. On pirate ships, this hierarchy sometimes collapsed. Crews that operated by democratic articles might distribute captured blankets more evenly. Every man received 1 before any man received 2. This practical egalitarianism was not idealism. It was recognition that a crew weakened by cold could not work the ship effectively. Now, the sea chest served purposes beyond storage. A sailor positioned his chest near his hammock, creating a wooden barrier between himself and the drafts that swept through the lower deck. The chest blocked wind. It diverted air currents around rather than across a sleeping man. Some sailors slept with their chests opened, using the lid as an angled windbreak that directed cold air upward and away. In extreme cold, a man might sleep inside his chest if he was small enough and desperate enough. The wooden box, though unpadded and cramped, trapped body heat in a small space. A sailor curled on his side, knees drawn to chest, lid closed above him, breathing the warming air his body produced. This was suffocation risk. This was desperate measure. But on the coldest nights, when ice formed on the rigging and the deck above drummed with freezing rain, a man did what kept him alive until dawn. The chest also protected the blanket during the day. A sailor stored his bedding inside when he went on watch, preventing it from being borrowed or stolen by men from other watches. Theft of blankets happened. It happened more often than officers acknowledged. A man who lost his blanket to theft faced nights of brutal cold, unless he could trade for another or take one himself from someone weaker. These possessions, a thin straw mattress, a single wool blanket, a wooden chest, constituted a sailor's entire provision for warmth through months at sea. No other resources existed. No additional comfort waited below. A man made these simple things sufficient, or he suffered through darkness counting hours until sunrise. On the coldest nights, the space between hammocks disappeared. Men hung so close that their shoulders touched through canvas, that the heat from one body warmed the man beside him. This proximity was not comfort, it was survival built into the ship's very design. Hammocks hung 14 to 16 inches apart when properly rigged. The distance was measured and enforced by regulations on naval vessels. Enough space that a man could climb into his hammock without disturbing neighbors. Close enough that the maximum number of crew could sleep in the available deck space. But this measured distance also created something the regulations never mentioned. It created rows of human warmth, dozens of bodies radiating heat into the shared darkness. A sailor sleeping in the middle of a row benefited from warmth on both sides. The man to his left gave off heat. The man to his right did the same. The air temperature in the center of a packed sleeping deck ran several degrees warmer than the air or near the hull where cold seeped through wooden planks from the ocean beyond. Experienced sailors understood this. They claimed center positions when they could. Men on the ends of rows hanging near the hull felt the cold more severely. Their outboard side faced wooden planks that held the ocean's chill. No body heat reached them from that direction. On the worst nights, these positions became almost unbearable. Ice formed on the interior hull surface. The wood itself felt frozen to the touch. A man's shoulder or hip pressed against his hammock's canvas on that side felt the cold radiating inward. The ship's hierarchy determined who slept where, but that hierarchy functioned differently on different vessels. On a naval ship, the newest and youngest sailors took the coldest positions. They endured the hull's chill, while experienced able seamen claimed the warmer center spots. On pirate ships operating under agreed-upon articles, the distribution sometimes reflected different values. An injured man might be given a center hammock to aid his recovery. A man suffering from illness might be positioned away from drafts. The crew recognized that a man weakened by cold could not perform his duties, and a ship that could not be worked properly endangered everyone aboard. Young crew members, their bodies still adapting to life at sea, sometimes suffered hypothermia more readily than hardened sailors. Experienced men recognized the signs, the violent shivering that eventually stopped, the confusion, the dangerous drowsiness. On nights of extreme cold, older sailors sometimes positioned themselves deliberately beside younger crew members, their body heat providing an additional margin of survival. This proximity meant physical contact. A man felt his shipmate's body against his own through the canvas. He felt the other man's warmth. He heard every breath, every movement in sleep. There was no privacy in this arrangement, no personal space, no distance between bodies. Two men might sleep pressed together from shoulder to knee, separated only by 2 layers of canvas and whatever clothes they wore. No shame attached to this contact. it was never spoken of as intimacy. It was recognized for what it was: simple physics applied to survival. Warm bodies grouped together maintained higher temperatures than warm bodies separated. This was observable fact. This was practical knowledge that every sailor learned. On the coldest nights, men sometimes shared a single hammock. Two sailors climbed into one canvas bed lying back to chest, sharing blankets and body heat. The hammock's curve forced them into contact along their entire length. The combined warmth of two bodies in one enclosed space created temperatures that one man alone could not achieve. This practice was accepted without comment. It was survival, nothing more. The watch system meant that men occupying adjacent hammocks might be on opposite schedules. A sailor finishing his watch at midnight climbed into a hammock still warm from the man who had just left it to go on deck. The canvas retained heat. The space inside held warm air. A man wrapped himself in that residual warmth gratefully, knowing that in 4 hours he would leave the same gift for whoever took the hammock next. This sharing of warmth functioned as an unspoken agreement among the crew. Every man contributed heat to the collective space. Every man benefited from the heat others provided. A man who isolated himself, who somehow managed to claim a hammock far from others, suffered for his privacy. The ship offered no warmth to individuals. It offered only what men created together. On ships with experienced crews, this cooperation functioned automatically. No one gave orders about sleeping positions. No officer directed men to share hammocks. The crew organized itself according to accumulated knowledge of what worked. The oldest sailors had survived dozens of winter crossings. They knew how men stayed alive in cold. Younger sailors learned by observing, by following the example of men who had endured. Some crews developed specific patterns. Men of similar size might pair together for hammock sharing, their bodies fitting together more efficiently. Men who snored violently might be positioned near the hull, where their noise disturbed fewer sleepers. Men who thrashed in sleep, fighting nightmares that came from trauma witnessed at sea, might be given end positions where their movement didn't wake an entire row. These arrangements represented practical wisdom refined over generations. Nothing was written down. Nothing appeared in official regulations or ship's logs. But every sailor learned these patterns, and every crew recreated them, voyage after voyage. The knowledge passed from experienced men to new sailors through demonstration and quiet suggestion, part of the vast body of unspoken expertise that made survival possible. The warmth shared between bodies was small comfort on a freezing night at sea. It did not make anyone warm. It made cold slightly more bearable. It provided the margin between sleep and sleepless misery, between maintaining strength and gradual weakening. Men pressed together in darkness, strangers bound by nothing except the shared necessity of staying alive until morning, creating what heat they could in a wooden world that offered none. The night aboard a ship was not a single, unbroken passage from sunset to dawn. It was divided into watches, 4 hours on deck, 4 hours below, then 4 hours on deck again. Sleep came in fragments, not in the long stretches a body might prefer on land. A sailor finished his watch at midnight. He climbed down into the darkness below deck. He found his hammock. He wrapped himself in whatever he had. He closed his eyes. 4 hours later, another sailor shook him awake. His turn on deck had come again. The cold air above waited. The work waited. Sleep ended before the body felt fully rested. This pattern repeated every night at sea. No one slept through from dusk to sunrise. No one experienced the deep rest that comes from 8 uninterrupted hours in a warm bed. The watch system made that impossible. It was necessary for sailing the ship. It was necessary for safety, but it meant every sailor lived with constant grinding fatigue. The disruption went beyond the individual sleeper. When one watch descended to rest, they brought cold air with them. They moved through the cramped space between hammocks. They bumped into sleeping men. They spoke in low voices. They settled into their own hammocks with the creaking of canvas and the scrape of rope. The quarters never fully quieted. Someone was always arriving. Someone was always leaving. When the other watch rose to take their turn on deck, the disruption came again. Men extracted themselves from tightly wrapped blankets. They pulled on stiff outer garments. They shuffled toward the ladder in near darkness. More cold air entered as the hatch opened. More movement rippled through the sleeping area. The men trying to rest felt each disturbance. This constant interruption would seem to make sleep impossible. It would seem to leave every man exhausted beyond function. But the human body adapted. Exhaustion itself became an ally. A sailor who had worked 4 hours hauling lines in freezing wind did not lie awake worrying about comfort. He did not need perfect silence or complete stillness to fall asleep. He simply collapsed into his hammock and lost consciousness almost immediately. The watch system created its own kind of rhythm. The body learned to expect it. Sleep became something grabbed in short bursts rather than savored in long stretches. Sailors developed the ability to fall asleep within minutes. They learned to sleep despite noise and movement around them. They learned to wake quickly when their time came. This was not the natural sleep pattern humans preferred, but it was the pattern the sea demanded. The fragmentation of sleep had an unexpected benefit in cold conditions. 4 hours felt manageable. A sailor could endure 4 hours of cold. He knew another watch would replace him. He knew he would soon be below deck, away from the worst of the wind. The night did not stretch endlessly ahead. It was broken into achievable segments. This made the cold more bearable, even if it made rest less complete. The same fragmentation applied to sleep below deck. 4 hours in a cold hammock was difficult, but finite. A man could curl tight. He could keep his breath shallow and controlled. He could hold still to preserve warmth. He knew he would wake before too long. He knew morning would eventually come. The watch system divided the night into pieces small enough to survive. The watch rotation also meant the sleeping quarters never grew completely cold. As one group of men left, another group arrived to replace them. Each arriving sailor brought body heat with him. Each hammock stayed occupied almost continuously. The collective warmth of 40 or 50 men never fully dissipated, because the men never all left at once. The space remained inhabited. The temperature stayed above the brutal cold of the open deck. Still, the interruptions took their toll. No sailor at sea felt truly rested. The fatigue accumulated over weeks. Men learned to sleep with their eyes half open. They learned to dream in fragments. They learned to function on rest that never quite reached the deeper stages the body needed for full recovery. This was simply the price of life at sea. The watch system kept the ship sailing. It kept everyone relatively safe. It made proper sleep impossible. These facts coexisted without resolution. The hammocks below deck outnumbered the full crew. This might suggest comfort and choice. It did not. Ships carried fewer hammocks than sailors because at any given moment half the men stood watch on deck. The hammocks that existed were shared. One sailor slept in a hammock during his off-watch hours. When he rose to return to duty, another sailor took the same hammock. This practice had a name: hot bunking. The hammock stayed warm. A sailor climbed down from his watch at 4 in the morning. His body was cold from wind and spray. His hands were stiff. His face was numb. He found the hammock assigned to him. Another sailor had just left it minutes before. The canvas still held warmth from that man's body. The wool blanket inside still carried heat. The sailor wrapped himself in this residual warmth. It was not much, but it was more than nothing. It was better than climbing into a hammock that had been empty and cold for hours. This sharing of warmth was unintentional in design, but crucial in effect. The hammock never fully cooled. It passed from body to body like a relay. Each man added his heat during his 4 hours of rest. That heat lingered long enough to benefit the next man. Over the course of a night, a single hammock might hold 3 different sailors. Each one found it slightly warmer than the surrounding air. Each one contributed to the warmth the next would feel. The practice was born entirely from necessity and efficiency. Ships had limited space. Hammocks took up room, even when hanging empty. Fewer hammocks meant more space for cargo, for guns, for supplies. The watch system meant half the crew was always working. Providing a hammock for every man would have been waste, so the hammocks were shared. The warmth that resulted was a benefit no one had planned for, but everyone appreciated. The canvas itself held heat better than might be expected. Canvas was woven tightly. It was thick. It absorbed the warmth a body radiated and released it slowly. A hammock that held a sleeping man for 4 hours became a reservoir of heat. When that man left, the canvas stayed warm for perhaps half an hour. If the next man arrived quickly, he benefited fully. Even if minutes passed, some warmth remained. The wool blankets inside the hammocks mattered even more. Wool retained heat even when the body left. A sailor who wrapped himself tightly in a wool blanket for 4 hours left that blanket warm throughout. The next man pulled that same warm wool around himself. He felt the heat another man's body had created. In the coldest nights, this made the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness. Hot bunking also meant the hammocks themselves never grew damp with condensation, and then froze. An empty hammock in freezing air would collect moisture from the surrounding atmosphere. That moisture would chill the fabric. A sailor climbing into such a hammock would feel the cold immediately, but a hammock that was constantly occupied stayed dry. Body heat evaporated any moisture that tried to settle. The fabric remained as dry as anything could be at sea. The practice created an unintended intimacy. A sailor slept where another man had just slept. He felt the warmth of a body he might barely know. He breathed air another man had warmed with his breath. He lay his head where another head had just rested. On land, this would seem strange, perhaps uncomfortable. At sea, it was simply how things worked. No one remarked on it. No one questioned it. The cold made such considerations irrelevant. Some sailors developed preferences. They learned which shipmates slept hot. They learned who generated the most warmth. They timed their rest to follow those men when possible. A young sailor with a fast metabolism and strong circulation might leave a hammock noticeably warmer than an older man or someone weakened by poor diet. This knowledge circulated quietly. Men adjusted their routines when they could to claim the warmest hammocks. The efficiency extended beyond individual comfort. Hot bunking meant the entire sleeping area maintained a baseline of warmth. Paikanera, at no point did all the hammocks hang empty and cold. At no point did the space lose all human heat. The rotation of bodies kept a low but steady warmth present at all times. This elevated the temperature of the entire area by perhaps a degree or two, small but meaningful when the alternative was the unheated air approaching freezing. The system had no formal rules. No officer assigned hammocks based on watch schedules to maximize warmth transfer. It happened organically. Sailors learned through experience. They adapted. They took advantage of whatever small comfort the situation offered. Hot bunking became one more invisible thread in the web of practices that made survival possible. The warmth passed from man to man, watch after watch, through the long, cold nights that stretched across weeks at sea. The body itself understood what the mind might not yet have learned. On freezing nights at Laudian Eich, sea sailors found positions and postures that conserved heat through instinct and experience. These were not taught through formal instruction. They were discovered through cold necessity, refined through countless nights, and passed silently from veteran to novice through observation and survival. The hands required protection first. Fingers lost heat rapidly. Blood vessels in the extremities narrowed in cold conditions, sacrificing the outer body to preserve the core. Sailors learned to tuck their hands inside their clothing. Some pressed them beneath their arms, where large blood vessels ran close to the surface. Others drew their hands between their thighs, creating warmth through compression and proximity to the body's center. A few threaded their hands inside their waistcoats, holding them flat against their chests beneath layers of wool. These positions felt awkward at first. They restricted movement and felt unnatural to men accustomed to physical labor. But after an hour in the hammock, after the cold had begun its work, the wisdom became clear. Protected hands stayed functional. Exposed hands grew numb, then painful, then dangerously cold. The choice was simple. The body curled naturally into what would later be called the fetal position. Sailors drew their knees toward their chests. They bent forward, rounding their backs, tucking their heads down. This posture minimized the surface area exposed to cold air. A body stretched out presented more skin to the environment. A body curled tight kept its warmth concentrated, reducing the boundary where heat could escape into the surrounding cold. The hammock's shape encouraged this position. The canvas curved, cradling the body in a gentle arc. Lying flat felt unstable in a hammock. The natural tendency was to curl into the fabric's embrace, and this instinct served survival as well as comfort. The tighter the curl, the smaller the space that needed warming, the less heat lost to the air. The head required covering. Sailors knew this without understanding the physiology. Blood flow to the brain could not be restricted the way blood flow to fingers could. The head continued to radiate heat even when the rest of the body had begun shutting down peripheral circulation. A bare head meant steady, significant heat loss throughout the night. Knitted caps were pulled low, covering the ears and forehead. Some sailors wrapped scarves or strips of wool around their faces, leaving only their eyes and nose exposed. Others pulled their coat collars up and their cap brims down until their faces nearly disappeared. The fabric trapped warm air around the head and absorbed the moisture of exhaled breath before it could escape into the cold. Breathing itself became a tool for warmth. Sailors learned to breathe into the hammock fabric, directing their exhalations into the wool blanket or canvas that surrounded them. Each breath contained heat. Each exhalation was a small gift of warmth to the immediate environment. By breathing into the fabric rather than out into the open air, sailors created pockets of slightly warmed air within the cocoon of their bedding. This required conscious effort at first. The instinct was to turn the face outward to seek fresh air in the stale, crowded quarters below deck. But fresh air meant cold air. The air within the hammock, warmed by body heat and breath, was several degrees warmer than the air outside it. The difference seemed small, perhaps 5 degrees, perhaps 7. But over the course of a 4-hour watch below, those degrees meant the difference between fitful cold and something approaching rest. Movement was the enemy of warmth. Every shift of position disturbed the carefully warmed microclimate inside the hammock. Cold air rushed in. The warm pocket of air that had taken 30 minutes to create dispersed in seconds. Sailors learned to find a position and hold it. They trained themselves to ignore minor discomforts, small itches, the desire to stretch cramped legs. This stillness was difficult. The body naturally shifted during sleep, seeking comfort through position changes. But at sea in winter, comfort came through thermal stability rather than physical ease. Experienced sailors could remain nearly motionless for hours, their bodies locked in heat-conserving positions, moving only when the watch change required them to rise. The hammock itself aided this stillness. Unlike a flatbed where rolling over was easy, the hammock's curved shape made major position changes difficult. The sailor rested in the lowest point of the arc, held there by gravity and the canvas walls on either side. Small movements were possible, adjusting an arm, shifting the angle of the legs, but large movements meant fighting the hammock's geometry. This mechanical constraint served thermal preservation. Sailors also learned where to position themselves within the hammock's length. Lying perfectly centered left the head and feet near the hammock's ends, where cold air circulated more freely. Shifting slightly toward one end meant the body's core occupied the deepest, most sheltered part of the curve, while only the feet or head extended toward the less protected area. Most sailors shifted toward the head end, protecting the torso and keeping the feet, already cold and difficult to warm, in the more exposed position. These techniques were not discussed in formal terms. No officer instructed new sailors in the proper sleeping position for cold weather. The knowledge passed through observation and through the body's own learning. A sailor who slept with arms stretched out woke with aching, frozen hands. A sailor who kept his head uncovered woke with a cold that settled deep in his chest. The lessons were physical and immediate. The cold night at sea began its approach long before darkness fell. Sailors who understood this prepared throughout the afternoon and evening. Their preparations were not elaborate. They consisted of practical actions, small adjustments, and careful attention to the body's needs. These rituals made the difference between a night of miserable endurance and one of survivable rest. Food was the first preparation. Sailors ate their largest meal in late afternoon, when the day's work was winding down but several hours of daylight remained. This timing was not arbitrary. The meal needed to be substantial enough to fuel the body through the coming night, but early enough that digestion would be well underway by the time sleep began. Digestion produced heat. The body's work of breaking down food, processing nutrients, and converting calories into usable energy generated warmth from within. This thermogenic effect lasted several hours. A sailor who ate a large meal at 4 in the afternoon carried that internal warmth with him into his hammock at 8 in the evening. The body's core temperature remained slightly elevated, providing a foundation of warmth that external cold would take hours to overcome. The meal itself mattered. Salted meat and hard biscuit, the staples of sea rations, required significant digestive effort. This was generally viewed as a hardship. The food was difficult to chew, hard on the stomach, and monotonous beyond description. But the digestive work involved translated directly to heat production. The body labored to process these dense, difficult foods, and that labor generated warmth. Sailors also learned to drink their grog ration in the evening, rather than saving it for later. The rum provided a brief sensation of warmth, though this was largely illusion, as alcohol actually caused blood vessels to dilate and increased heat loss. But the warm water mixed with the rum did raise core temperature temporarily, and the psychological comfort of the ritual mattered. The body prepared for cold, partly through physical warmth and partly through mental readiness. Physical activity before sleep served the same dual purpose. Some sailors performed simple exercises in the hour before their watch below. They bent and straightened their legs, swung their arms, flexed their fingers. These movements raised body temperature and increased circulation. The effect lasted into the first hour of sleep, giving the body a thermal advantage as it settled into the hammock. This practice was not universal. Many sailors were too exhausted from the day's labor to consider additional exercise. But among those who remained at sea for years, who survived winter voyages and returned for more, the evening routine of movement before rest was common. It required only a few minutes and cost nothing but effort. Staying dry during the day's work was understood as essential to night survival. This was easier stated than accomplished. The sea was everywhere. In spray that swept the deck, in water that sloshed in the bilges, in rain that fell for days without pause. But sailors learned to minimize wetness where they could. They changed positions to avoid standing spray. They sought shelter behind masts and rails when possible. They wrung out wet clothing before going below. Wet fabric at night meant a cold night. The water in the cloth drew heat from the body continuously, evaporating slowly in the damp air below deck. A sailor who went to his hammock in dry wool stood a far better chance of maintaining warmth than one who tried to sleep in damp clothing. This knowledge shaped behavior throughout the day. The evening's rest began with the morning's careful attention to staying as dry as conditions allowed. Some sailors changed their outer layers before sleep. They removed wet jackets or soaked shirts and replaced them with items from their sea chest that had stayed somewhat drier. This was a luxury few could afford regularly. Most sailors owned only what they wore, but those who possessed an extra shirt might alternate them, wearing one while the other dried as much as it ever would in the humid air below deck. The sea chest itself played a role in evening preparation. Sailors positioned their chests near their hammocks, creating a small windbreak. The wooden box blocked some of the air movement in the crowded quarters. It also served as a step, making entry into the hammock easier. And it held the spare clothing, the extra blanket if one existed, the small items that made cold nights slightly more bearable. Before climbing into the hammock, sailors checked their bedding. They shook out blankets to remove any moisture that had condensed during the day. They adjusted the hammock's hang, ensuring it was neither too taut nor too loose. They positioned their caps and scarves within easy reach. These small actions took moments, but established the conditions for whatever warmth the night might offer. The mental preparation mattered as much as the physical. Sailors knew the night would be cold. They accepted this. They did not lie in their hammocks hoping for warmth that would not come. Instead, they prepared themselves for discomfort, for hours of cold that had to be endured until the watch change brought them back to movement and work. This acceptance was not resignation. It was realism. The night would be cold. The body would survive it. morning would come. The evening rum ration arrived before darkness settled completely. A gill of rum mixed with 3 parts water, the mixture sailors called grog. The liquid burned going down. It created a sensation of warmth spreading through the chest and limbs. This warmth was an illusion. The alcohol actually dilated blood vessels near the skin surface, pulling heat away from the body's core. What felt like warming was the beginning of heat loss. But the feeling mattered. In those minutes after drinking, a sailor felt warmer. The psychological comfort was real, even if the physical effect worked against survival. The ritual mattered as much as the drink itself. Men gathered on deck or below, waiting for their ration. They drank together. The shared moment marked the transition from work to rest. It signaled that the day's labor had ended, that sleep would come soon. This mental marker helped sailors accept the discomfort ahead. Stories began in the space between grog and hammocks. Men spoke of past voyages, of ports visited, of storms survived. They recounted encounters with merchant ships, with Navy vessels, with other crews. The stories were rarely dramatic in their telling. They unfolded slowly, with careful attention to practical details. How a sail was rigged, where provisions were hidden, what an unfamiliar coastline looked like at dawn. These narratives served multiple purposes. They passed knowledge between experienced sailors and newer crew members. They maintained connection between men who would soon lie in darkness, separated by silence. They occupied minds that might otherwise focus on cold, on wet clothing, on aching joints. The voice of a shipmate describing a harbor in the Caribbean carried listeners away from the present moment, away from the freezing night ahead. Singing served a similar function. Sea shanties had begun as work songs, their rhythms coordinating group labor. In the evening, they became something different. The songs were quieter, slower. Melodies drifted through the spaces below deck. Men lying in hammocks joined in, their voices creating harmonies in the darkness. The singing generated no physical warmth, but it created psychological warmth, a sense of shared humanity, of companionship in hardship. The tradition of evening storytelling and song was not unique to pirates. All sailors practiced these rituals. But on pirate vessels, where formal naval discipline did not exist, these informal traditions carried more weight. They were the primary means of maintaining group cohesion. They reminded isolated men that they were part of a crew, that others endured the same cold, that survival was a collective effort. The human body possesses remarkable adaptive capacity. Sailors who spent weeks at sea in cold conditions underwent physiological changes. These changes were gradual, often unnoticed by the men themselves, but they made survival possible. Core body temperature regulation improved with sustained cold exposure. The body became more efficient at restricting blood flow to extremities when necessary, protecting vital organs. At the same time, it developed better circulation patterns for rewarming fingers and toes when danger of frostbite appeared. This balance between conservation and circulation sharpened over time. Metabolic rate increased slightly in sailors subjected to chronic cold. Bodies burned more calories at rest, generating additional heat. This adaptation required adequate food intake. When provisions ran low, the advantage disappeared. But on well-supplied vessels, sailors' bodies became slightly more efficient furnaces, producing warmth from the same rations that would provide less heat in unadapted individuals. Subcutaneous fat distribution changed. Bodies deposited fat in patterns that provided better insulation. This process took months. Young sailors who survived their first winter voyages often returned to port, looking physically different. Not merely thinner from labor, but carrying weight in different areas. Their bodies had reorganized resources for survival in cold. The shivering response became more controlled. Initial exposure to cold triggered violent shivering, the body's automatic heat generation through rapid muscle contractions. After weeks at sea, shivering became more measured. It activated sooner before core temperature dropped dangerously, but with less intensity. This controlled response generated heat while consuming less energy. Sleep patterns adapted. The fragmented sleep imposed by watch rotations would destroy health in men living ashore. But sailors' bodies learned to extract rest from shorter periods. They fell asleep faster. They reached deeper sleep states more quickly. Their bodies compressed the restorative functions of sleep into whatever hours were available. This adaptation served them well on cold nights, when exhaustion actually helped them rest despite discomfort. These adaptations had limits. The body could not create warmth from nothing. It could not eliminate the need for dry clothing, adequate food, or shelter from wind. But adaptation moved the threshold of survival. What would incapacitate an unprepared person became merely uncomfortable for an acclimatized sailor. What would be uncomfortable for a new crew member became barely noticeable to a veteran. The adaptation was temporary. Sailors who returned to life ashore lost these advantages within weeks. Bodies readjusted to heated rooms, regular sleep, and stable temperatures. When they returned to sea, they faced the adaptation process again, but each time became slightly easier. The body retained some memory of its previous adjustments. Young men who began sailing in their teens developed deep tolerance. By their 20s, they could endure conditions that would be fatal to others. The body kept count of every frozen night. It recorded each watch stood in freezing wind, each morning waking in damp wool, each day that began without true warmth. The toll appeared in fingers and toes first. Chilblains developed slowly. Small blood vessels in extremities, subjected to repeated cold exposure, became inflamed. Fingers swelled and itched. Toes throbbed inside wet stockings. The skin turned red, sometimes purple. The sensation burned and ached simultaneously. Sailors recognized the condition immediately. Nearly everyone aboard developed chilblains at some point during a cold voyage. The feet suffered particularly. Boots and shoes stayed damp for days, sometimes weeks. The leather never fully dried. Stockings remained perpetually moist from spray and condensation. Skin softened, macerated, became vulnerable. Painful swelling appeared. Some men developed infections. The condition resembled what soldiers in later centuries would call trench foot, flesh damaged by prolonged exposure to cold and wet. Joints stiffened as voyages progressed. Knees ached when climbing rigging. Shoulders protested against rope work. Hands lost flexibility, fingers curling slightly even when relaxed. Older sailors moved more carefully, their bodies bearing the accumulated damage of years at sea. The cold worked its way deep into tissue, settling into bones that never quite warmed. Respiratory illness followed cold like shadow. The combination of damp air, crowded quarters, and weakened immune systems created perfect conditions for sickness to spread. Men developed coughs that persisted for weeks. Some coughed so regularly it became part of their identity. The sailor's cough, expected and accepted. Lungs strained against the constant assault of cold, damp air. The skin itself changed texture. Constant exposure to salt, wind, and dampness left it rough and cracked. Hands developed calluses over calluses, but between the thickened patches, splits appeared. These small wounds healed slowly in the cold, damp environment. Some became infected. Sailors learned to live with minor infections, addressing only those that threatened to worsen seriously. Atlantic crossings consumed 6 to 8 weeks. For the entire duration, sailors endured conditions that never significantly improved. There was no weekend, no day off from the cold. The ocean stretched in every direction, and the ship moved slowly across its vastness. Winter voyages tested endurance most severely. Some men lost fingers to frostbite when temperatures dropped and winds increased. Toes blackened and died when circulation failed. Captains faced difficult decisions: continue the voyage or seek port for medical attention. Usually the voyage continued. The damaged tissue was already lost. Stopping would not restore it. In extreme conditions, some captains permitted brief controlled fires. A metal brazier might be brought below deck for an hour, carefully monitored, extinguished at the first sign of danger. These moments of warmth were rare. The risk remained enormous. Most captains accepted cold as the safer hardship. The psychological endurance required was immense. Day after day of cold, with no certain end date, wore on minds as surely as bodies. Sailors watched the horizon for signs of approaching land or warmer waters. They tracked the ship's position obsessively, calculating remaining distance, estimating days until conditions might improve. The promise of warmth sustained them. Experienced sailors spoke of tropical waters, of nights where blankets became unnecessary, of waking without stiffness. These descriptions functioned as encouragement, evidence that the cold was temporary, that the body would eventually remember what warmth felt like. Letters and journals from the period describe cold nights with striking acceptance. The tone was not one of complaint but of documentation. This was simply how life was lived. Men wrote of frozen rigging and numb fingers with the same matter-of-fact quality they used to describe daily rations or wind direction. The cold was a fact, like the ocean itself, vast, undeniable, and beyond any individual's power to change. The body adapted, not completely, not comfortably, but enough. A sailor who survived his first winter crossing would face the second with greater tolerance. The shivering became less violent. The fingers retained feeling longer. The shock of cold air on the face each morning diminished slightly. Human physiology made adjustments over weeks and months. The circulation improved in extremities, the metabolic baseline shifted, the threshold for discomfort moved. These changes were not dramatic. They were incremental, but they accumulated into something that resembled capability. Most sailors were young. Many were still teenagers when they first went to sea. Their bodies possessed the resilience that youth provides, the ability to recover from discomfort, to sleep despite conditions, to wake and work and function on insufficient rest. An older body might have failed where a younger one adapted. The crews that worked these ships were not composed of seasoned elderly men. They were composed of boys becoming men in an environment that tested them nightly. The alternative ashore was often worse: starvation in port cities, unemployment without prospects, debtor's prison, or the noose for petty theft. These were the realities that made a cold hammock at sea seem acceptable. A sailor ate regularly, even if the food was poor. He had employment. Even if the conditions were harsh, he had companionship, even if it was forced by proximity. The cold nights were a price, but the price bought survival in an era when survival was never guaranteed. Eventually, steam came. Metal hulls replaced wooden ones. Ships gained heating systems, enclosed quarters, bunks with real mattresses. The age of freezing nights at sea gradually ended, though it took decades to fade completely. Tonight, you rest in warmth those sailors could not have imagined. Your bed is soft. Your room is heated. The cold remains outside where it belongs. As you settle into sleep, you carry with you now a quiet awareness of what warmth means and what it once meant to sleep without it, rocking in darkness on cold water, wrapped in wool, surviving through nothing more than knowledge, proximity, and the stubborn endurance of the human body. Rest well.